Hey class, welcome back. In this lecture here, we're actually going to start going into chapter number 1. When I finish this chapter, because I want to break it into two parts, I think you'll see why as we go through it. Well, let's start in verse number 1, and let's read the first 3 verses, and let's sort of get a context for what the writer here, who I believe is Paul, is trying to accomplish. It starts out uniquely different from all the other letters in the New Testament. It doesn't say Paul an apostle, Peter an apostle, John the well-beloved. It doesn't have any of that. It just simply says, God, who at sundry times and in divers manners spake in time past unto the fathers by the prophets. It's a long sentence. It's got a lot of phrases into it, so let's break it down. God spoke. God, in different times, in different manners, spoke. God spoke or God spake in the past. He did so at different times, he did so in different ways, and he spoke to the fathers by the prophets. In these last days, verse 2, he's spoken unto us by his Son, whom he hath appointed heir of all things, by whom also he made the worlds, who being the brightness of his glory, and the express image of his person, and upholding all things by the word of his power, when he had by himself purged our sins, sat down on the right hand of the majesty on high. God hath spoken by his Son. If you want to hear God, you have to listen to Jesus. If you want to see God, then you have to look at Jesus. This is what the Apostle Paul is talking to in a group of people that were very religious growing up. What profit hath the Jew? Much chiefly every way. Unto them were committed the oracles of God. And these people had grown up under the law of Moses. These people had grown up anticipating the Messiah. These people had grown up religious. They knew in their heritage, in their pedigree, that God had spoken by a donkey, and God had spoken in a burning bush, and God had spoken by dreams and by visions, and God had spoken orally, and God had written on the wall, and God had spoken by his prophets. God had spoken in a lot of different ways. But that wasn't the way God was speaking now. There's been a dispensational shift. In the past, we had here a bit, there a bit, line upon line, here a little, there a little, but now the accumulation of all of that prophecy is now coming manifest in the revelation of God, his Son manifested. So the writer here, Paul, writes to this group of Jewish believers, and he wants to remind them, don't look to Moses, look to Jesus. Don't look to the sacrificial lambs, look to the Lamb. Don't look to the law, look to the Lord. And this is what he's trying to drive home in these opening verses. Because remember, chapters 1 through 6 is to remind us of our motivation, why we should go into spiritual maturity. And the motivation is, think about how great Jesus is. And so in verses 1 through 3, the apostle establishes a few basics. Number 1, the theme of this book isn't interested in who the human writer is. It's not the most important thought. This book starts out with God, and it ends with God. The other thought here in chapter 1 is that God, as we look through the course of human history down the past quarters of time, God used a lot of different avenues, a lot of different venues, a lot of different methods to speak. But in these last days, right now, in these last days, which began at the day of Pentecost, in these last days, he's spoken unto us by his Son. The rest of chapter number 1 is going to tell us some interesting characteristics about this Son. I'll come back to that in a moment. If time permits, we'll put it into one lecture. If not, we'll break it up. I want to stop for a moment and just ask a question that I don't cover in the introduction. It's a basic question. If I were to ask you, to whom was the book of Galatians written? The majority would say to the churches of God in Galatia, to the churches in Galatia. Who was 1st and 2nd Corinthians written to? To the saints in Corinth. Who was Romans written to? To the saints at Rome. What is the story of Philemon? There was a church in his house. Titus is written to. Titus. to help those people there in Crete. And Ephesians is written to the church at Ephesus, of which Timothy was a pastor. And so 1st and 2nd Timothy are written to him. And on it goes. If I were to ask you to whom was the word of exhortation written that we call the book of Hebrews, what would your answer be? To whom was this book written? There's several thoughts here. Some people say it was written to Jewish communities at large. And as Jewish communities, it was made up of believers and unbelievers. There might be merit in that. Some try to nail this down to a specific region. Some would say it's to the Jews that are in Italy. And that's why Hebrews 13, those of us in Italy greet you. Though that could just as easily mean you're outside of Italy, and so all of us in Italy are greeting you. Some say that it was written to the Jewish people, the Jewish congregation in Antioch, where Barnabas and Paul had spent so much time, and now with persecution coming and the reign of Nero sort of causing some terror, that this church was feeling some persecution, and the writer here is writing back to them. I don't know if we can be dogmatic, so let me tell you where I sort of lean to. I lean to the fact this is written to Jewish believers. I think I can be dogmatic on that, and we'll talk as we go through the book. Personally, I sort of lean toward that this group may have been, I'm not dogmatic, but they may have been in Antioch. And that the writer here is sensing that they're feeling pressure to come back to Jerusalem to help in this persecution and to defend Jerusalem as Jewish people. And there's this underlying theme here that Jesus in the Olivet Discourse has already prophesied the destruction of Jerusalem. To turn your back on Christ to defend a city that he's already handed over to judgment would not be a wise decision. As painful as it may be, rather than going back to Jerusalem and back to Judaism, you need to go outside the gate, outside the camp, where Jesus was, and bear his reproach. And that's in chapter 13 as well. We'll come back to all that and tie it up full circle at the end. The historical background, Jewish believers, probably in Antioch, maybe not, they're still in this area where they aren't as mature as they should be. In fact, Hebrews 5 says they've been saved long enough. They should be teaching other people. Instead, they need to be taught with the first principles, the oracles, the milk. The writer was saying, you've been saved long enough, you should be able to handle meat. And I have to keep feeding you with milk. If you're going to be on a milk diet your entire Christian life, you're not going to be able to stand in adversity, and you're not going to go into maturity. And so the writer encourages them, exhorts them to go into maturity. And that's sort of the background here. So he's giving them a word of exhortation to accomplish a desire in him that he wants them to leave the shadows of the law, Hebrews chapter number 10, and go to the substance that's found in faith in Christ. What do you mean? Well, Hebrews chapter 10 verse 1 says the law had a shadow of good things to come, not the very image. It was a shadow. Hebrews 11 verse 1, now faith is the substance. Let's leave the shadows, symbols, and let's go to substance. Let's leave the milk and let's gravitate to the meat. And so he writes to these people and he says, you've been a believer long enough. It's time to move past the ABCs. Here on our campus, and even online for that matter, we teach biblical languages. We teach Hebrew and we teach Greek, and we teach also Spanish as well here on our campus. If you come to a Spanish class, a Greek class, or a Hebrew class, you're going to spend a little bit of time learning the alphabet. You may learn, someone may have you teach, this is a Hebrew class, we'll use the Hebrew alphabet, and maybe it's Aleph, Bet, and Gimel, Dalet, Hey, and Vav, and Zayin, Hathan, Tathan, Yod, and Kaf. They might teach you the Hebrew alphabet song. It's sort of a cool song. It sort of gets you almost agitated a little bit, you know. Aleph, Bet, and Gimel, Dalet, Hey, and Vav, and Zayin. It's, whoa. So it just sort of gets the heart racing. And if you're in a Greek class, they make alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon, zeta, eta, theta, and let me go through this alphabet with you. Okay. When you're in kindergarten, your teacher would teach you this song. A, B, C, D. Remember that? E, F, G. And we'd sing the song, The Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. Now imagine your senior year of Bible college, or let's take it a step further, you've graduated from Bible college, you're now finishing your doctoral program, you're in your final class of your doctoral program, and the class is entitled The English Alphabet, EN 901. And the professor takes the first 6 weeks of a 7-week class to teach you the alphabet. Some of you would eventually figure out, wait a minute, that's not what I'm paying for. I'm beyond that. I already know the alphabet. I need to know how to put these letters together and form words, and put these words together and form sentences and phrases and clauses, and speak eloquently and with clarity and accuracy. And how do I word all of this in a way that helps me to be a better communicator of the gospel? If you haven't picked up on the point yet, in the Christian life, there comes a time when it's time to leave the ABCs behind and go on to the meat. And so in Hebrews chapter 5, this is exactly what he's telling them. In the first century, persecution is mounting. And there's some intense persecution upon believers. I don't know if I can do it justice, but here's sort of the background. Hebrew parents are seeing their children turn to accept Jesus as the Messiah. They've rejected him. In fact, some of them were even there in Jerusalem when they said, his blood be upon us and upon our children, our children's children. They had made a definitive choice to no to Jesus. And as their children began to accept Jesus, it brought tension. And in the mid-60s, leading up into that great war that ended with the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, the pressure was something like this. If you're accepting Jesus as your Messiah, then to us, your parents, you're dead. And they were kicked out of their home. There were funerals held for their dead child. You would try to go and buy your meat at the kosher places, and the community was such tight-knit that they wouldn't even look at you. May I help you? And you're standing right here. May I help you, sir? They wouldn't look at you. You're dead. But there was always this implicit understanding. If you'll reject Jesus, if you'll come back home to Judaism, all can be forgiven, all can be forgotten. And this created pressure, intense pressure. And now there's persecution mounting from Rome. And there's persecution from Jewish people. You love Jerusalem. You pray for the peace of Jerusalem. You see Roman armies gathering around it, and you're debating, you're waffling. Do I go back? Do I go back? And this isn't the only generation that's dealt with this. Do I go back? And do I reject Christ? And maybe I can just, make it all better when the persecution goes away. This happened often in the Roman Empire. The tide is mounting. The persecution is mounting. And if you're going to be able to stand during this type of pressure, you've got to have spiritual maturity. You've got to have it. And so there's some underlying themes, pictures, illustrations. They're just under the surface. It's not as if the apostle says, let me take you back in our history and tell you the story. It's more like when you grow up in a place, you know the culture, and you don't even have to tell the entire joke. You can just say just a few words and everybody starts laughing, but the stranger in the midst of them, what? I don't get it. They don't get it because they don't know the culture. When you know the culture, you can take shortcuts. When my wife and I first got married, I'm from Georgia and she's from Michigan. We lived in Georgia for 5 months before we moved to California in 1995. We've been here ever since. But when my wife was moving to Georgia, it was a totally different culture for her from Michigan. Totally different. She would go to the store. Everybody called her honey or whatever. They wanted to ask her questions. They wanted to know about her life. They were wanting to show an interest. They were being friendly, but she just wanted milk. That's all she wanted. She didn't want to give her a life story. The pace of life was very, very different, slow. People would just sit on the front porch and rock, and she was like, let's do something. It's just different culture. things could be said at church, and people sort of, yeah, I remember that. And she's like, my God, what are they talking about? And it'd take me 10 minutes to explain what the rest of us understood with just a sentence. In like manner, Paul, the Jew, is writing to Hebrew believers. And there's some things that are just sort of understood in the culture. But because you and I are on the outside of that culture, I need to point it out so you can sort of keep it in mind as you read through the book. One of the things that are there is this idea of the journey from Canaan, or from Egypt to Canaan. There's a story there where they were to walk by faith, walk by faith, walk by faith, and the generation fell because they wanted to walk by sight. If you remember the story, 12 spies are sent to spy out Canaan. You know the song, 10 were bad, 2 were good. These 12 spies were spying out Canaan. 10 came back with an evil report. Only Joshua and Caleb said, we're able. God can give us this land. The wicked spies, the 10 spies, and wicked maybe is a strong word. I believe they might have had good hearts. They just had no faith. I'm going to be justified in calling them wicked in a moment when I get to chapter 3. Not in a moment. That's like, you remember the other day, and it was 10 years ago. We'll get to chapter 3, but it's not going to be in a moment, okay? But when we get to chapter 3, you understand why I'm calling these men wicked. These wicked spies had a common thread. Number 1, the land is exactly what God said it was. That was true. Check. We agree with God there. Number 2, we can't take it because there's giants in the land. God was big enough to get them out of Egypt, but in their mind, he wasn't big enough to get them into Canaan. And somewhere, there was a thinking shift, a shift in their thinking. Oh, to get out of Egypt, it's going to take God. God's got to do that. We've been here 430 years. If we're going to get into Canaan, we just need a bigger army. All of a sudden, they thought that God could get them out of Egypt, but they had to get themselves into Canaan. Look, you can't get to Canaan without the power of God. The understood element in this typological story, Egypt is a type of the world. We hear that often. Crossing the Red Sea is the deliverance, we might say salvation. Journeying in the wilderness, it's immaturity. You're not going forward. You're not going forward. You're not advancing. You're not spiritually progressing. You're just spinning circles. Immaturity. Crossing the Jordan with Joshua, that's not salvation. They've already been delivered. This is a type of surrender. We're going to do it God's way. So we step out by faith. And in Canaan, Canaan isn't a type of heaven. There's giants there, there's sin there, there's death there, there's giants there. That's not heaven. But Canaan is a type of victory when God enables you to claim what he wants you to have. So victory, maturity. This book, the whole book of Hebrews, is going to focus on God's Son. He's the focal point. He's superior in his person to Moses, to Aaron. He's superior in his priesthood to Melchizedek, to Aaron, to anybody else. He's superior to angels. I mean, he's just, as we learn in chapter number 1 in our next lecture, he's just God. The theme of this book, making progress. If we're going to do that, we have to do it with the power of God. I'll come back to that in chapter number 6, but can I leave you with this thought? You don't get saved by grace and go to maturity by works. It's not God starts you on this race and you got to finish it on your own. God's grace is working throughout. Remember the words of that famous song by Newton, Amazing Grace? It's grace that's brought me safe thus far. It's grace that leads me home. The entire Christian life is a journey of grace and faith. So yet we're saved by grace, but we're sanctified by grace too. Yet we trust Christ because of his grace, but we grow in maturity because of his grace as well. There's no way to get to spiritually Canaan without the power of God. Can I leave you one more thought? I got a lot of thoughts. It's going to be hard to finish this book, but I'll leave you one more. These first 6 chapters is going to tell us about Jesus for one reason. Because the more we know about him, the more we'll love him. And the more we'll love him, the more we'll want to serve him. Here's the key. Love is able to produce obedience. For the rules, there's the relationship. So as we come to chapter number 1 and finish it, we've looked at these first couple verses and then try to get a background. But I want you to notice how the apostle will start. He's going to tell us why Jesus is God. And we'll cover that in the next lecture, okay?